I tell you what, it's not like the olden days. I'm Rosie.
I'm Jake.
And this is our podcast on Alice in Wonderland. Last time, when I was announcing the next podcast, I didn't want to say it would be on Alice in Wonderland because I'm so pedantic. I said it was on a couple of adaptations of Lewis Carroll's Alice books, which of course are called Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass, with the subtitle And What Alice Found There. But really, if you want to talk about the whole sort of franchise, I think it's very reasonable to call it Alice in Wonderland, and the two films we're really going to be talking about both are called Alice in Wonderland and are adaptations of both books. Now, the Alice books actually aren't among the children's classics that really speak to me. I'm not that keen on the books, especially the second one, Through the Looking Glass. But we have enjoyed a couple of the adaptations, of which there have been many, because in the great scheme of things, it is a very well-remembered and beloved couple of books that Lewis Carroll wrote. And I've heard people say in interviews and things, such as Gene Wilder, who we're going to be talking about acting in one of these adaptations, suggest that it's a very important and a very special magical children's book because Wonderland is so important. It's such a wonderful, huge part of childhood, and it's so lovely, and you lose it when you grow up, and okay, that's fine, except that I really don't get that from the story, because Alice really doesn't seem to like Wonderland very much, and doesn't find it special and magical and wonderful at all. I've also read or heard people suggesting that the effect is derived from the contrast between Wonderland and Alice being a very serious child. And really that's why she seems to find Wonderland so annoying, and I think that's probably more like it. And there are so many references from Alice in Wonderland that get into other books and films and various media, and there have been many adaptations inspired almost as much or just as much as by Lewis Carroll's words by the original illustrations by John Tenniel, and I think we're going to probably refer to those a few times. I've seen bits and bobs and clips of various adaptations, animations and live action, and particularly some of the older ones try to recreate John Tenniel's illustrations so faithfully that they end up using prosthetic masks and things and making the stuff of nightmares. When we were very young, we saw Disney's Alice in Wonderland, which we're going to talk about a lot. It's one of the two. And we had it recorded off the television on the same tape as The Wizard of Oz, the MGM film. And I was struck by the similarities between the two, a girl going to a fantasy land and not particularly liking it, and what Disney has Alice do, which she doesn't in the book or other adaptations, is start wanting to go home, like Dorothy does. And in both those films, it all turns out to be a dream. Of course, the difference is that MGM made that up for their movie. It's not what L. Frank Baum intended, whereas Lewis Carroll did say that Alice's Adventures in Wonderland were a dream. And since then we've seen a few things. Most recently, Tim Burton has done a very bizarre sequel starring Mia Wasikowska and of course Johnny Depp, and I don't really want to talk about that. I thought it was very ill-conceived, very badly done, and its sequel, Through the Looking Glass, which I found out a bit about.
The one thing I took away from those Tim Burton movies, or the one particular thing about that first movie that made me think, well, I hate this, was that Tim Burton was trying to surprise us or say, oh, you didn't know that, did you? By introducing the term Underland instead of Wonderland. But of course, any vaguely knowledgeable viewer will know that Wonderland was called Underland first, and indeed the working title of Lewis Carroll's first book was Alice's Adventures Underground. So really, Tim Burton, you can take those films and your attempts to be clever within them and stick 'em.
Also, we've watched an adaptation that I think is generally quite well liked, starring Fiona Fullerton as Alice from the 1970s, and neither of us was very keen on that one. the characters sing too much. They'll sing things that really are supposed to be spoken. For instance, the Queen of Hearts will sing off with her head and off with his head. And the White Rabbit, played by Michael Crawford, they let sing pretty much all his lines as far as I remember. But we're only going to talk to you about the Disney film and the other one that we've seen, a TV movie which was made in 1999 by the same production company that made Merlin, starring Sam Neill, which we've also podcasted about before on our Camelot podcast. And what I'd really like to do is talk about them sort of side by side and compare the portrayal of the characters and situations and things in each one.
When we used to watch the 1951 Disney animated movie when we were children, in the early 90s, our mummy and granny used to go around saying, well, what's that doing in Alice in Wonderland? This is supposed to be through the looking glass. That's supposed to be through the looking glass. This isn't through the looking glass. And our granny read us quite a few bits of the books, partly to show us which bits were in Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, the book, and through the looking glass, the book. And indeed, it's true, a lot of the things in Disney's Alice are from the looking glass, and they made no secret of it. It says at the beginning of the film, adapted from both those books by Lewis Carroll. And reading the two books as an adult, it really struck me how, while pretty much all of the first book has been adapted, if not in the Disney movie, then in other things, in the case of Through the Looking Glass, they really do, when adapting, pick bits out of it, pick and choose what they're going to use from Through the Looking Glass. And I think that is a very wise decision. You were saying Through the Looking Glass wasn't nearly as good as Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, and I certainly thought so too, reading through it. A lot of it is complete nonsense and too dreamlike, I thought. And I thought it was absolutely the right decision to pick out the bits that are right for adapting and are good and put them in the adaptations alongside some of most of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. I don't think there's anything in Through the Looking Glass, the book, that I haven't seen adapted somewhere in some way on screen in amongst things from Alice's Adventures in Wonderland that I would like to see brought to the screen. When we were watching that 1972 movie with Fiona Fullerton and Michael Crawford, despite the fact that it was absolutely awful, I was thinking, now, is here actually an adaptation which is actually all Wonderland? And then I was quite surprised when Tweedledee and Tweedledum turned up, because they actually are the only thing from Through the Looking Glass that were put in that Fiona Fullerton movie, which is rather anomalous, I think. But they're certainly a popular thing to adapt. And of course they're in both the main adaptations that are the subject of this podcast. The Disney movie really does draw heavily on Through the Looking Glass, not only with some of the characters that we're about to go through, but also in creating the surroundings of Wonderland itself. Disney's Wonderland, in many ways, is the world of the Looking Glass. It has the Tolgee wood in it. It has the mome rats. It has bread and butter flies and rocking horse flies and that sort of thing, which work very well as a way of bringing Wonderland to life in an animated movie. But it's interesting to spot that they are actually from Through the Looking Glass.
If you have a mind to, you can read in various introductions and wikis and things about the real Alice, a child called Alice Liddell, and you can read some really quite disturbing things about how Lewis Carroll was planning to marry her, and her parents eventually forbade him from ever seeing her again. But none of that sort of thing encroaches on either of these movies. Disney's Alice is played by a child, or she was a child at the time, by the name of Catherine Beaumont, who I read had been brought to America by her parents in an effort to force her to be a child actress. And so she was in the right place at the right time to be the voice of Alice, with her English accent and her talent for acting and for singing. And really it was Catherine Beaumont's performance that first gave me the impression that Alice really didn't like Wonderland. And I remember the very first time I saw this film, which was probably even the late 80s, before we went on and watched it a lot in the early 90s. When she got to Wonderland, I thought, this isn't consistent with the song she was singing earlier. A world of my own. Cats and rabbits would reside in fancy little houses, and the flowers would sit and talk to me for hours, and all these things are happening, and she hates it. She thinks it's absolutely stupid. So Catherine Beaumont's performance is very good, very engaging. It does come across as rather grumpy and exasperated a lot of the time. That's in the voice, and also you can hold her responsible for the animation, because they dressed her up as Alice and filmed her acting out some of the scenes in order to give the animators a live action reference.
Walt Disney was just as bad as Lewis Carroll, really, in his way. He used to take Catherine Beaumont and parade her around in her Alice costume and take her on the telly for Christmas specials and things. And you can read about how he was quite ruthless with his child actors, and when they were no longer children and cute and looking and or sounding like he wanted, he used to cast them aside. Bobby Driscoll is the ultimate example of that. He played Peter Pan at the height of his popularity with Disney and ended up overdosing on drugs in a New York slum when he was about 30 and had to be identified by dental records in the end. So while Walt Disney did create a lot of magical and wonderful parts of children's childhood, these things certainly do come at a price. Although not such a heavy price for Catherine Beaumont as for Bobby Driscoll. At the time of recording this podcast, Catherine Beaumont is still alive and in her early 80s.
The design of Disney's Alice is very Tennelian. The dress with the full skirts and the pinafore and the long hair, traditionally coloured with a blue dress and blonde hair, which Disney's Alice has got. It's in his illustrations for Through the Looking Glass that Alice acquires her Alice band, further evidence of how much she and her story are in the collective soup. She has a hair accessory named after her. And it's in Through the Looking Glass that she gets her striped stockings. And Disney's Alice doesn't have the striped stockings, but does have the Alice band, and I think people generally like to see her with an Alice band, though she doesn't have it in the illustrations of the first book.
It's always interesting to find out these things, isn't it? Alice didn't have her Alice band until the second book. Dorothy didn't have the surname Gale until the third Oz book. Tigger doesn't appear until the second collection of Winnie the Pooh stories. Harmony is not in Cordelia's gang in the first episode of Buffy.
Now I'm going to try to give an impression of what this TV movie from 1999, the very end of the Olden Days, is like. We actually didn't get to see it until Easter 2000. It's an American production, and the USA got to see it in 1999.
They actually filmed it in the summer of 1998, didn't they? So it was almost 2 years old by the time we got to see it. Of course, there must have been a lot of computer effects to add in and play around with. So it's not surprising it probably wasn't ready to air on television in the US until almost a year after they'd actually filmed the live action bits. And then somebody thought premiering it at Easter 2000 on Channel 4 on British television was a good idea, alongside Jemima Rooper and the Railway Children. And on the whole, I think we've thought over the past 21 years, it was a good idea.
Alice was played by a young American actress called Tina Majorino, and I think the first thing I'd like to say is that she can do a much better English accent than most American actors seem to be able to do. I won't say that there isn't the odd little twang here and there that gives her away, because there is, but it really doesn't matter. And she's my age. She was born in February 1985. I was born in July. So when she was filming Alice in Wonderland, she was 13 years old. So she was a real child, which is always nice to see in these things. In the older ones, you can see adults playing Alice. To this day, you can see adults playing Amy March and people like that. Fiona Fullerton was 17, which I can't really say is a bad thing because Judy Garland, aged 17 as Dorothy, I admire very much. But Tina Majorino was 13, and I think she does an absolutely stunning, astonishing job of playing Alice, being very engaging, very, very talented, and carrying this whole big elaborate production on her young shoulders.
It's so important, isn't it, to have that linchpin of the main character really working and being an excellent performance. It wouldn't matter how many Robbie Coltrane's and Miranda Richardsons and Pete Postlethwaites you put in it. If Alice didn't work, it would not be good to watch. You were comparing it, I thought very aptly, to Muppet Treasure Island, where Kevin Bishop does exactly the same job as a linchpin as Jim Hawkins, a relatively unknown child actor from the time he had been on Grange Hill first, surrounded by more well-known grown-up actors who they're going to put on the literature to try and sell the film, such as Tim Curry and Billy Connolly and Jennifer Saunders, in the case of Muppet Treasure Island.
The film starts with a giant metronome, and in the first second you might be thinking, what is this? You sure this is Alice in Wonderland? And then on walks Tina Majorino, looking like a John Tenniel illustration from Through the Looking Glass, with the stripy stockings of the Alice band, that's appeared in a colouring book, and someone has coloured not with the traditional yellow hair and blue dress. She has brown hair and a yellow dress. And I think it's actually very clever to dress her in that way. She's got her own hair, I suppose. If they'd found a blonde actress to play Alice, goodness knows what they would have done. Even if you don't realise it, when you see Alice, you're getting the message. This is a traditional adaptation. It's not set in the present day or anything silly like that, but we're putting our own spin on it, as you can see from the metronome. And I suppose the own spin they put on it really comes out in a number of ways, including some of those effects that you mentioned. But the most obvious thing, the thing that you can most get a handle on to explain why it's a bit different, is that they've added in their own motivation and journey for Alice, which is that she doesn't want to sing, and she particularly doesn't want to sing Cherry Ripe. She seems to have something in particular against that song, in front of her parents' stupid friends who she doesn't even know, who they're having to their stupid garden party. The way that it's presented suggests that that is what the audience is supposed to think, and of course her mother is terribly emotionally manipulative. She says, if you really don't want to do it, Daddy and I will understand. They will be terribly disappointed. And the actress who plays Alice's mother says that line very well and makes us think how awful but how typical.
There comes a point in your life, doesn't there, where you have to stop the metronome that your parents have set ticking for you and have the confidence to do your own thing, which is what Tina Majorino's Alice does at the end of the movie, and a very good conclusion it is. I always liked, even at Easter 2000, when I was coming out of the age of non-believing, really, how there was that point to the film. Alice's experiences were going to lead her on a journey to grow as a person. She was going to come out of it saying, yes, I am confident, and go and put that into practice to show her parents and entertain the guests in her own way.
And I think by the end of the century, perhaps a lot of us have got to the point where we don't really like the idea of Alice in Wonderland being a dream. We've all gone off the idea that it was all a dream if we read a story or see one on the screen. Tina Majorino and friends came up with quite a good sort of compromise on that for the traditionalists who don't want it to be completely real, because it being a dream is kind of the point, really. But it's the kind of dream now where it's also real. It's more of a spirit journey. If you're wondering how Tina Majorino's Alice in Wonderland compares to Merlin, I think it's a lot better, a lot more successful. I think with Alice in Wonderland, perhaps it's because it's less complicated. There's only one piece of original source material to draw on rather than loads of legends, although we shall explain that they've also taken some inspiration from Disney. It does also have certain similarities to Merlin in the atmosphere, the way the crazy world feels. It's not so much pixies and fairies and things, but it is woodland and strange creatures. And there's a kind of very old legend sort of feel about both of them, before the woodland creatures got caught up in sentimentality and cuteness. It's really stripped that back, I think, and they feel more kind of primal and eldritch. And really, that's a kind of a difference between Tina's Alice in Wonderland and Catherine's Alice in Wonderland, because of course Disney is very colourful and things are quite sort of cute. On the other hand, there are some ways in which Disney's Alice feels a bit darker than the live-action production, which I'm sure I'll remember to come to when we get onto the relevant characters. Now, I have got my copy of the book for reference to remind me which characters Alice meets, so we'll talk about them in order of when they appear in the book. And of course, the first one, as everybody knows, is the White Rabbit. That's another thing that's got into the soup, Follow the White Rabbit. It's in the Matrix, for one thing.
That reminds me, talking about the beginning and when the White Rabbit turns up, we were agreeing when watching the Disney movie how it was good that they made the effort to include Dinah, Alice's cat, actually in the park with Alice and her sister listening to the history lesson. Of course, in the books, that's another thing that's from Through the Looking Glass. Dinah the cat appears in person, having been mentioned only in the first book. And of course the Tina Majorino production knows to put Dinah in as well, and she's a very lovely grey tabby cat stretching out in front of the fire and getting petted by Tina. So that's definitely a must for your Alice adaptation, Dinah the cat, particularly if you want to have a real world character to compare to the Cheshire Cat later.
I do remember when I first saw the Disney film being quite surprised that Dinah didn't make it all the way down the rabbit hole with Alice, because she very nearly does. She has to cling on and scramble back up again, particularly following The Wizard of Oz, in which Dorothy has an animal companion, Toto, the little Scotty dog. The White Rabbit, as I was saying, really is in the soup, isn't he, with his pocket watch and how he's going to be so late, and Alice's curiosity and wondering where the heck he can be going. And Disney's White Rabbit is very Disney-looking. The interpretation of the character is not something that I think you can really find a lot of in the book. He's quite sort of neurotic and frightened, and a very good way of proving this point is to explain that in the book he wants to burn his own house down in order to get the giant Alice out, thinking that she is a monster, whereas Disney have the Dodo, who we'll get to soon, kind of bullying the White Rabbit and brushing him aside when he's saying things like, "Oh, my poor house and furniture," because he really doesn't want his house burnt down, and yet he's so timid and obedient that he hands the Dodo the match right in the middle of protesting about him burning down the house, which made us laugh when we watched it recently.
I've always really liked that burn the house down scene. The Dodo is so funny in it, and when the White Rabbit's gone off worrying about how late he is, and Alice has shrunk and gone off as well, and therefore there's no reason at all to burn the house down, even if it was one in the first place. The Dodo's still trying to do it, and we leave him there trying to burn down the White Rabbit's house for no reason. Indeed, that's a very prominent way that the White Rabbit is funny in the Disney movie, as a kind of foil to someone doing a funny comedy sequence. And the other big example of that is when the White Rabbit turns up at the tea party, and the Mad Hatter and the March Hare are doing crazy things to his watch, and the White Rabbit is only able to take a very passive but panicky role in that scene.
Now, in the live-action production, they create the animal characters in a few different ways.
I think the White Rabbit in that is really a mixture of full costume animal acting and certain bits of animation.
And they do put a very peculiar effect on him of a sort of frantic, wound-up toy. At the beginning of the film, where the actors are listed on the screen and stuff like that, the camera's panning around Alice's nursery, and you can see some things that are going to come to life in Wonderland, such as a Tweedledee or Dumb doll. So perhaps that was the idea behind it, that he was a sort of toy rabbit brought to life, but nothing else is really quite like that in Wonderland, so it does seem very odd. The character is portrayed much more like he is in the book, wanting to burn down his own house, again, is the main thing that springs to mind. Apart from that, I suppose he doesn't really have an awful lot to do, apart from worry that he's late and later on read things out for the Queen of Hearts. And I suppose you could argue that Disney have done a better job with the White Rabbit because they've given him more characterization and developed him a bit more from the book. In the book and in the live-action film, the dodo doesn't have anything to do with that house-burning attempt. The rabbit himself is giving the orders to Bill, the lizard, with his ladder, who appears in both adaptations, being told to climb down the chimney, and Pat, who seems to be some sort of lizard or reptile, because that is what his clothes suggest in the live-action adaptation, sort of green scales. And here's another way in which they create animals, by just giving them clothes that are slightly suggestive of the animal. Bill in the live-action movie doesn't look like a lizard either, and if I hadn't seen the Disney film or read the book, I don't think I'd realised that he was a lizard.
There's one instance in the whole movie of using what I call the bump effect in reference to the Ink Thief, even though in the Ink Thief it's cartoon versions rather than a film of a real animal. But with Mr. Mouse, played by Ken Dodd, you see him first as a real mouse, and then he morphs into a person version of a mouse, which works very well. But I think they could have made more extensive use of that effect, with such as Bill and Pat, the reptiles, and Mr. Mouse's friends, the duck and the lory and the dodo, and the frog footman and the fish postman. If you don't know what animals they're supposed to be, you might well not click. But if you do, you can see how those animals are being evoked in the costume and the makeup and the performance.
There's the dodo being mentioned twice. That use of him in the live-action movie is more like what you can read in the book. He's one of the small animals that Alice meets when she's small, that most memorably, I think, have the caucus race, which is really where you run around aimlessly, and really the point of it is that it's to get Alice dry after she has swum in her own tears. And it does appear in the Disney film very differently from how it appears in the book. The dodo is singing a song about the caucus race, and Alice and a lot of animals are running around a kind of post that he's on top of with a nice warm little fire, and they all keep getting soaked by waves coming in, and the dodo insists that it's going to dry them and says, "Why, I'm as dry as a bone already." But of course, the water isn't reaching him.
I've always really liked that bit, Alice saying, "Yes, but..." and then she gets muffled by a wave coming in, but you know what she's going to say. And it's quite satirical, really. It's what someone in a position of power, wealth, whatever, who has something which someone less fortunate doesn't have, will say, brush it aside, like, "Well, yes, I'm all right, so you should be." And yes, but there's a very obvious reason why I'm not. But of course, the person on the high ground isn't going to listen to that reason. I do like the adaptation of the caucus race in both movies. Liz Smith and Ken Campbell and Ken Dodd and people running around aimlessly amongst the big books is funny. Alice and all the animals and the waves coming in and the dodo being absolutely unreasonable is very funny as well.
Disney then takes the caucus race and does something very different with it, whereas the live-action movie, it is really very like the book. And then I think they improve on the book or interpret the book in a way that adds something when you see it on the screen. When they've all won and all must have prizes, who's to give the prizes? Why, Alice, of course. And in the book, it just says she found some bonbons in her pinafore pocket and handed them out. But on the screen, they have the actors sort of advancing on her with hands outstretched expectantly, looking a little sinister. And Tina Majorino reacts beautifully, looking rather worried and then relieved when she finds her bonbons.
It's very good, that bit, particularly Liz Smith vocalises it well, going, ooh, at the prospect of a prize from Alice, and then advancing towards her. Well, we're on the subject of that early bit of the film. I've always liked the doorknob, the talking version of the doorknob in the Disney version. And it works very well there in the animated Disney movie, and wouldn't really be placed correctly in the Tina Majorino movie, which has a non-talking door.
Like in the book.
But I think it adds just the right tone to drive that scene with Alice and the doorknob in the Disney movie. And whenever I'm going to talk about a bottle, I say, the bottle! Like the door when he's getting all Alice's tears in his mouth, which proves how much I like the character.
And talking of giant books and tiny doors and things, if you've a mind to, you can read about all the trouble that the Merlin production company went to create certain effects, and they built loads of different sized sets and all sorts of things. And actually the production won an Emmy for its effects, and it also won Emmys for costume and for music. All very richly deserved, I think. What's missing from the contents page, because it's hardly worth mentioning, is the dog that chases Alice. She has to hide in a flower pot and throw a stick to distract it. Disney, quite wisely, I think, didn't bother with that, but the live-action movie did, and it's a little dog we see at the garden party, perhaps brought by one of the guests. It doesn't seem to be Alice's dog. She doesn't seem to like it. There's no more to say about the dog than that, but there are probably a few things to say about the caterpillar. In the live-action movie, he's played by Ben Kingsley, and we have discussed before that it's not one of the standout performances, but I don't think it's really the fault of the actor. I think it's just a rather strange interpretation. He's a sort of Sergeant Major character who speaks to Alice rather sort of gruffly, and there doesn't seem to be much reason for it, except that it's a way of speaking to her in short sentences, which she objects to, and I believe is a line from the book.
That's really the only performance or character interpretation in that movie that I don't like. Perhaps it's not Ben Kingsley's fault, but I'd have said if asked I found his performance of the caterpillar rather flat. Perhaps it's just what he's given and the way they do the character in the movie.
The Disney caterpillar is also quite grumpy and terse with Alice. Of course, that's what he's like in the book. But they haven't gone for any odd interpretation. He looks like a Disney caricature of a caterpillar. Alice being quite grumpy as well in that production. They really don't seem to get on with each other very well. Tina Majorino sometimes will laugh at something that's going on, which Catherine Beaumont never does, and she does laugh at the caucus race, I remember now. And then because she's on this spirit journey and gaining some confidence and trying to get over her performance anxiety, Ben Kingsley's caterpillar actually says a few kind words to her. You mustn't be afraid, that's worse than not remembering. In both movies, he turns into a butterfly, and we were quite surprised when the caterpillar did not turn into a butterfly in the book. He just sort of crawls off. So there's one instance where that live-action movie seems to have taken some inspiration from Disney. Now, after trying a bit of the mushroom to make her grow taller, in the book, Alice grows very tall with a very, very long neck. And when you read that, if you have seen the Disney movie first like we did, it makes more sense of the bird that she encounters, thinking that she is a serpent. And Disney has a short sequence of this bird being frightened that Alice is going to eat her eggs. The live-action movie doesn't bother with that. She manages to grow to her usual size straight away with the mushroom, and then go and meet the Duchess. Disney doesn't have any Duchess. One of the old black and white films does have a Duchess with one of those prosthetic masks I was mentioning earlier, because John Tenniel has done a really very peculiar illustration for that character, and another old movie tried to recreate this by having a man play the Duchess. Tina Majorino's movie didn't do anything like that. They got Elizabeth Spriggs to play the Duchess, and they put some funny hair and makeup on her, and then let her do her performance, which I think is much better than trying to recreate the original illustration, making a terrifying or a weird Duchess.
I always found Elizabeth Spriggs very good to watch, be it in Simon and the Witch, or the first Harry Potter movie, or The Tomorrow People, or Agatha Christie's Poirot. I think she adds a certain something to Tina Majorino's film, as does Sheila Hancock as the Duchess's cook, throwing the plates and the pepper and so on around.
Of course, outside the house, Alice meets the frog footman who you mentioned earlier, who you might not realise was a frog if you didn't know. I'd think he was some sort of marine creature with a froggy, fishy mouth. I think that's the way in which they most manage to evoke a frog. And he's very good too, having the conversation with Alice about how it's no good knocking because she's on the same side of the door as him.
Oh, wasn't it striking when we first saw it and we thought of Happy Families, the children's BBC series from our very early childhood, because there's a Happy Families baby, which is very weird and dreamlike and is a rubbery puppet and looks like it could turn into a pig at any moment.
Now, these effects that keep coming up of babies and animals are supplied by Jim Henson's Creature Workshop, who I think definitely deserve a mention. But the Cheshire Cat, I think, is all CGI. And of course, she is in the Duchess's house because she belongs to the Duchess. And I say she because the Cheshire Cat is played by Whoopi Goldberg. If you read the book, you will see that the Cheshire Cat is only ever described with the pronoun it, except by the Duchess herself with the line, "He's a Cheshire Cat," which unfortunately makes it into the film where a woman is playing the Cheshire Cat. So I suppose then the Duchess is one of these people who just guess the gender of their pets, of which there are, sadly, quite a lot. Now, what we haven't really said explicitly, but perhaps implied once or twice, is most of the characters in Wonderland appear as real people at Alice's stupid parents' stupid garden party. For instance, Liz Smith and those other small animal people are there.
The frog footman is on Alice's parents' staff and is going around serving tea.
And you could interpret it, if you wanted to, that the Cheshire Cat is there in the form of Dinah. You said she's a grey tabby, well, so is the Cheshire Cat. Getting a woman to play the part, having a female Cheshire Cat, really adds to that impression. And whether it was deliberate or not, I do think that Alice sees the Cheshire Cat as more of an ally than the other characters, most of them. And the Cheshire Cat at least attempts to give her some good advice, although it doesn't necessarily work out very well being in Wonderland, where everything is so topsy-turvy. And of course Alice likes Dinah a great deal more than she likes all the stupid people that she's supposed to sing to. The Disney movie goes with a male Cheshire Cat, and this is one of the actors' names I have bothered to remember. He is one of Disney's pool of actors from around that time, Sterling Holloway, who also plays Car, the python in the Jungle Book, and Winnie the Pooh. And those two characters really are, aren't they, on opposite ends of the spectrum of how much they want to be your friend and how much they want to kill you. And the Cheshire Cat is really somewhere in between the two, and I sometimes think the voice suits the Cheshire Cat the best of those three characters. He does give Alice some advice, some information anyway. Doesn't seem to wish her any ill until the croquet party towards the end, where he gets her into some quite bad trouble. I said there were some ways in which the Disney movie is perhaps a little bit darker than the live-action movie, and I think the Cheshire Cat is darker in Disney.
Like the Widgets in Through the Dragon's Eye, I suppose, in many ways, he's just naughty and rather mysterious. Enjoys seeing people getting into trouble for the lulz. I think the whole Cheshire Cat sequence in the woods was a part of the Disney movie that I did particularly enjoy when I was young. We used to laugh about it together sometimes and say, "Can you stand on your head, ha ha ha," and that sort of thing. That voice of Sterling Holloway really has become the definitive voice of Winnie the Pooh, and he was doing it for Winnie the Pooh for the rest of his life. And even to this day, Jim Cummings is copying that Sterling Holloway Winnie the Pooh voice for Disney. And yet, I do agree, the Cheshire Cat is the character it suits best.
Of course, with him standing on his head and the appearing and disappearing, Disney have done some very striking animation. Half of his stripes will disappear before the other half, and his grin appears as the moon and that kind of thing. They've really gone to town with Lewis Carroll's descriptions of how he can appear and disappear. He does have to introduce himself as a Cheshire Cat, as the Duchess isn't there to do it. And when I first heard that the Cheshire Cat belonged to the Duchess, I thought, well, how does that work then? Do they do anything together in the book? But they don't really. In the book and in Tina Majorino's movie, the Cheshire Cat's just sitting there, and the Duchess says he's a Cheshire Cat, that's why he grins. Cheshire Cats always grin. And then the Cheshire Cat really does talk to Alice separately after that. So it's quite understandable that Disney decided to have the Cheshire Cat, thinking children ought to like it, and they didn't need to bother with the Duchess.
You can find on the DVD initial storyboards and ideas for Disney's Alice movie with the Duchess and the baby and the cook in them. But ultimately they decided not to go with the whole concept, and I don't think it damages the movie at all. And I too was very surprised to start having to think of the Cheshire Cat as the Duchess's cat. I remember watching Tina Majorino for the first time and thinking, oh, there's the Cheshire Cat on the mantelpiece. What's it doing there? It should be in the woods. And then, of course, a little later, it was.
And in both adaptations and in the book, the Cheshire Cat directs Alice to the Mad Tea Party. A lot of people seem to think it's the Mad Hatter hosting the tea party, but if you read the book, in fact, it's the March Hare. And I do enjoy very much Disney's Mad Tea Party. The conversation that they have only takes a few bits from Lewis Carroll's Mad Tea Party, such as why is a raven like a writing desk? And then other bits of the conversation they take from elsewhere.
I remember when our granny was reading us the Humpty Dumpty scene from Through the Looking Glass, and he was saying he had a belt that was an unbirthday present. And I thought, oh, that's from Through the Looking Glass. It works well as a reason to have a mad tea party.
The unbirthday song that they sing is very catchy and good fun, and Alice finds them singing it and gets them to explain what an unbirthday is. And once she understands, says, why then it's my unbirthday too. And the Mad Hatter and the March Hare are very surprised, and the Hatter says, well, what a small world it is. Which is very funny, because if you meet anyone, it's much more likely than not to be their unbirthday.
That's very funny. I do love that scene. I think it's my favourite scene in the Disney movie, where they're doing things like dunking the plates in the tea and eating the plates, and the March Hare's cutting off the stream of tea with his ears and so on. It's just very mad and very wacky and very stimulating.
You mentioned earlier that the White Rabbit comes and plays a part in that scene with his watch.
It's absolutely brilliant, that bit with the watch, isn't it? Where they're putting in the jam and the butter and 2 spoons, yes, 2 spoons, 2 actual spoons rather than 2 spoons of sugar. And then what an absolutely brilliant kind of twist punchline. March Hare just putting in mustard, and the Mad Hatter draws the line there. Mustard? Don't let's be silly. Even when we were very young, we knew how hilarious that was.
An interesting thing about that scene is that the voices, or at least every line by the Mad Hatter anyway, is taken from the live-action rehearsal animation reference that they did, because that actor, who was probably quite old in 1951 and not at all used to voice work, couldn't recreate that character on his own in the booth.
Yes, I do happen to remember his name. It's Ed Wynn, and he was an experienced comedy actor, and I also remember from looking him up on Wikipedia, he was born in 18-something, so doubtless the concept of acting on film rather than on stage was probably still quite new to him in some ways. Wouldn't have been what he trained with and was used to. So yes, voice acting would be another step into the unknown, and he wasn't able to get the best out of the Mad Hatter without doing the performance as well. So that's what they used, and it worked brilliantly.
I think that's my favourite scene in the Disney movie too, but by contrast, the Mad Tea Party is not one of my favourite scenes in Tina Majorino's movie. For a couple of reasons. Now, I'm not going to slag off the actors by any means. I do think that the interpretation of the March Hare is very peculiar. He's played by Francis Wright, at least the voice is played by Francis Wright. About 3 people are listed as being actors of the March Hare, a puppeteer perhaps, and an actual body. He's got a hare's head and a human's hands. There's another way in which an animal is evoked. I don't have anything at all against Francis Wright as an actor. I thought he was very good as the Sammy-ad, and I think I've seen him do other voices that I've enjoyed. And the head in Art Attack we've praised on another podcast. I do think it's a strange interpretation of the March Hare. It's sort of whiny and camp. March Hares, really, are supposed to be sort of butch and assertive, aren't they? Because they're fighting each other for the right to mate with the females. And for the adults, Disney implies perhaps that the March Hare might like to mate with Dinah if she turns out to be to his taste. And then there's Martin Short as the Mad Hatter, and I have said on the Merlin podcast that I don't like Martin Short's attempts to do an English accent because they're absolutely no good, and I'd rather that he didn't bother. In many ways, he's a very good Mad Hatter. It's a very outlandish, very mad, very engaging performance. I do think in this adaptation it wouldn't have mattered if he'd used his own accent. Other American actors do, such as Whoopi Goldberg. And I notice it particularly when he's talking about singing at the Queen's concert and the Queen shouting, "He's murdering the tune." And I notice it there because that line is wrong. It's supposed to be about how time won't do anything for him since the Queen's concert. And it's supposed to be that you beat time whilst you sing, and he was singing and the Queen shouted out, "He's murdering the time," by beating him. So there's a couple of reasons why I'm not very keen on the Mad Tea Party in that production. The rest of the conversation makes as much sense as it did in the book because it's pretty much the same. I do think it can get a bit tedious, such as the Dormouse's story about the treacle well. The bit I do quite like, because I think it's relevant to real life, is to point out I do say what I mean is not the same thing as I mean what I say. You might as well say that I eat what I see is the same as I see what I eat.
They go to great lengths to make Martin Short look like the illustration of the Mad Hatter with the kind of weird shrunken body, which I think is unnecessary. They should have just put Martin Short in a costume and had him do the thing in his own voice, and that would be a much better scene.
And from there, Alice goes on to the Queen of Hearts and the King of Hearts, etc., and the croquet is the main thing that they do.
I did find it interesting to learn in later life, or adulthood, they kind of merged the Queen of Hearts in the Disney movie with the Red Queen chess piece from Through the Looking Glass, the book. The Red Queen is actually the one who comes out with such lines as "curtsy while you're thinking, it saves time," which the Queen of Hearts says to Alice in the movie. But of course, the big one that I found very elucidating was "always here are Queen's ways, always here are my ways." It makes sense enough for a megalomaniacal character like the Queen of Hearts in the Disney movie to be saying that, but when you learn it's actually originally about the Red Queen chess piece, "always are Queen's ways," that makes a great deal of sense.
The design of the Queen of Hearts by Disney is very big and boisterous, and she goes bright red when she gets very angry. And then by contrast, the King of Hearts is a little man with a little voice and very little to say, except to occasionally pacify the Queen, try and calm her down a bit, and sometimes to forestall her cutting off Alice's head. He persuades her to have the trial.
I was knocked for six after watching the Disney movie so much by the representation of the King of Hearts in the book being kind of equally as powerful and important as the Queen of Hearts. Their Majesties, the King and Queen of Hearts, rather than building up to the Queen and the King. And indeed, in the Tina Majorino movie, the King of Hearts does play a much bigger role than in the Disney movie. He's played with Tina Majorino quite memorably by Simon Russell Beale and makes a very great contribution to the movie, particularly in the trial scene, which in the Disney movie is all the Queen.
Most memorably is the bit where, as Lewis Carroll puts it, he goes on to himself in an undertone, important, unimportant, unimportant, important, as if he were trying which word sounded best. That actor really makes something of that and annoys the Queen of Hearts with it. He sort of seems to change his mind about which one he means. So rather like Alice giving the prizes, they've taken something from the book and really added something to it on the screen. The Queen of Hearts to his King of Hearts is Miranda Richardson. Like Martin Short, she starred in Merlin, of course, and her interpretation of the Queen of Hearts is absolutely outlandish. She does a lot of shrieking, shouting, very shrill delivery of her lines, which not just anybody could pull off, but Miranda Richardson is a very good actress, and the production allows for her to really go all out with her interpretation of the character.
It works in that context, and Miranda Richardson does have the necessary skills to pull it off. We were discussing after watching the movie recently, it's a risky way to play it that might not have worked, but it actually works out perfectly.
The makeup and costume department fitted her out to look very much like the Queen on a playing card, and to some extent they did that with the King. Not so strikingly, I don't think, but perhaps it's more difficult to evoke because Miranda Richardson was able to use her shaved head and some kind of drawn-on hair, whereas in the Disney movie, the Queen really doesn't look like the Queen from a playing card, and I remember thinking I wish she looked a bit more like the Queen from a playing card, and she could still look like a person, because that's what they managed to achieve with the King. He looks kind of like a playing card king.
That's one of a couple of kind of little niggles I have with the card presentation in the Disney movie. The Jack of Hearts, when you see him for just a moment, is actually a full card, like the non-court cards, and the King and Queen are more people than cards, which I think is a little inconsistency. And also, since I learned that the gardeners were supposed to be spades, it's always annoyed the bejesus out of me that they're clubs in the Disney movie. I rather liked in the book how the Forsyths had their own designated roles at the royal court, the spades role being the gardeners, the clubs role being the guards, because of course they have weapons.
Diamonds are the noblemen and women, presumably, and I think the other hearts, it said, were the royal children. The hearts are the royal family.
That all works very well. I was also saying to you the other day how I quite like the way they mix in the chess from Through the Looking Glass in with the cards from Alice in Wonderland in the Tina Majorino adaptation. They've got a red bishop and a white rook being lawyers for the defence in the courtroom. They also put some dominoes in the courtroom surrounding makeup to make kind of a game's theme that doesn't mean just shoving in the chess pieces with the cards. So I think that all works very well.
What I was really thinking about when I said that in some ways the Disney movie is darker was The Queen of Hearts. Miranda Richardson is like a spoilt child having a tantrum, and no one ever really seems to get their head cut off. And Alice, speaking to the Queen, doesn't seem particularly afraid of her. She seems to think of her as a child having a tantrum. Don't keep shouting off with her head in case somebody shouts off with yours, she retorts at one point. Whereas Disney's Queen of Hearts will, with very little provocation, scream off with his head, off with their heads. And we see 4 cards, the 3 gardeners, and one who upsets her by not being in the right place to be a croquet hoop, all get dragged off to be executed, and there's absolutely no sign of any reprieve. And when Alice is desperately, fearfully trying not to upset the Queen, you really feel that she might be in danger of being beheaded.
And the culmination of that is that in the Disney movie, the trial is Alice's trial, where she has been condemned to execution, whereas in Tina Majorino, like in the book, it's the trial of the Jack of Hearts, the Knave of Hearts, for stealing the tarts.
You mentioned the Jack/Knave in the Disney movie. We only see him for about a second, whereas in the live-action movie he is a character. He's at the garden party chatting up some woman being a sort of rake, and Miranda Richardson and Simon Russell Beale are there playing croquet, and Miranda Richardson is rather sort of lording it over him that she's won the croquet match so easily. And without any lines, they really convey these characters in the garden party that are consistent with the characterization of the King and the Queen of Hearts. The Jack doesn't seem to be a Lothario, but then he doesn't have very much to do except stand at the trial complaining that he hasn't got very much to say, even though it's supposed to be his trial. Next in the book is the chapter titled The Mock Turtle Story. Now, the Mock Turtle is with the Griffin. Neither one of them appears in the Disney movie, but Tina Majorino does get to meet them. So did Fiona Fullerton, actually, and I only really bother mentioning that because it's relevant to John Tenniel's illustration of the Mock Turtle. Of course, Lewis Carroll got the idea from mock turtle soup, which is horrible, tough bits of meat. And John Tenniel's illustration shows a sort of cow with a turtle shell and flippers, I think. But Tina Majorino and friends really don't try to recreate that image. They go with their own interpretation of a mock turtle, which is Gene Wilder in a turtle shell with certain trousers and jumpers and things that are evocative of a sea creature.
I had a very interesting possible observation when we watched that movie the other day, actually, because I thought they had actually gone for cow hoofs on Gene Wilder's foot area. So perhaps those limbs were meant to be partly evocative of offal as well as sea creatures, which they certainly are evocative of. Bit of a hidden Easter egg there, I think.
While the Griffin is just a total puppet with the voice of Donald Sinden, and they both play those parts very well indeed. And I don't really laugh so much now that I remember what he's going to say, but in particular I find Gene Wilder very amusing when he's introducing the lobster quadrille, for instance. First you have to clear away all the jellyfish. And it's not really obvious he's necessarily been saying beat you to it on it's covered in jellyfish.
A very significant exchange, that, in Tina Majorino Alice's personal developmental journey. Of course, the Mock Turtle teaches her the song that she ends up singing at the garden party, which Lewis Carroll wrote the words of, and this production has put a tune to very successfully. They did the same thing with the Duchess's song about the sneezing baby. But I think the Lobster Quadrille song is more catchy and memorable. And really, that Mock Turtle scene for Tina Majorino's character, I've always thought is something of a turning point. Gene Wilder says to her at the end of it, "Now, I think you can begin to find your way." And Alice agrees. She is starting to become more confident. Her journey has a point.
And those are all the characters she meets in the first book, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. Tweedledum and Tweedledee do make it into both adaptations, as well as Fiona Fullerton's, as you said earlier. The designs in the Disney movie aren't necessarily very similar to John Tenniel's illustrations, but Tweedledum and Tweedledee really are quite similar, but of course Disney-fied, so they do look a bit softer and nicer and not so weird. In the Disney movie, Alice meets them quite early on, and they annoy her a bit, and then tell her the story of the Walrus and the Carpenter, which has a moral that they think is relevant in the Disney movie anyway, I'm not sure about in the book, about curiosity, because of course the oysters were curious, and ended up getting eaten by the Walrus and the Carpenter. Tweedledum and Tweedledee are voiced by the same actor, they have exactly the same voice, and also that actor alters his voice, goes higher for the Carpenter and lower for the Walrus, so he's doing that whole sequence. And an Easter egg there is that the oysters are going along with their shoes on, which was very odd because they hadn't any feet, but that isn't mentioned in the song that we get in the Disney movie, which is adapted from Lewis Carroll's original poem. And in Tina Majorino's movie, Tweedledum and Tweedledee do give her the original text. They're played by George Wendt and Robbie Coltrane, so there was no insistence that they had to be identical there, as Fiona Fullerton's Tweedledum and Tweedledee were. And something you point out is that they've taken inspiration there from the Disney movie by having one of them be the voice of the moon and the other one the voice of the sun in their representation of the poem.
I've always enjoyed Robbie Coltrane and George Wendt whenever I've seen them, and they certainly don't get seen together anywhere else. George Wendt has his parts to play in Cheers and Forever Young, and Robbie Coltrane, of course, is absolutely brilliant always, and he does do my favourite bit of that Tweedledum and Tweedledee sequence, complaining about the raffle being left out in the rain. It's spoiled! Robbie Coltrane does it absolutely brilliantly.
They do take from the book, which Disney don't, that whole sequence where they recreate the agreed to have a battle rhyme. And Alice dresses them up in saucepans and coal scuttles and things. And it finishes with them getting scared by the monstrous crow, and Disney doesn't do any of that. They do make a brief reference. If she sticks around, we might have a battle. I did also want to mention something that I thought of earlier when talking about how Tina Majorino's lot would take something from the book and then really enhance it, bring it to life with more humour on the screen, which is when Tweedledum and Tweedledee want to shake hands. And then Alice says afterwards, "It was funny to find myself singing Here We Go Round the Mulberry Bush. I don't know when I began it." Now, in the live-action movie, she doesn't begin it at all. Tweedledum and Tweedledee start singing it and dragging her round. And the performance of those two actors, the way they really deliberately seem to want to annoy her, is quite funny. A similar thing happens in the Disney version. They turn it into a song about how do you do and shake hands.
They've gone to the trouble in Tina Majorino of casting Peter Ustinov as the Walrus and Pete Postlethwaite as the Carpenter, which are quite striking but small roles. On our Robin Hood podcast, we mentioned that Peter Ustinov's standout performance from his whole life was Prince John in 1973 animated Disney Robin Hood. And Pete Postlethwaite has done a lot of wonderful things as well, including the only bit of William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet 1996 Leonardo DiCaprio, Claire Danes that I enjoyed, and the letter was of great import. So perhaps they're both a little underused, if not misused, in Alice in Wonderland, but a fun little contribution they both make anyway.
Tweedledum and Tweedledee also show her the Red King, the chess piece, asleep and say you're only a sort of thing in his dream, which is Lewis Carroll trying to be a bit sort of cosmic and thought-provoking, isn't it? Because the reader understands that through the looking glass is Alice's dream, and then to suggest that she's something in the Red King's dream is supposed to sort of blow your mind a little bit. I don't know if it really adds anything to the Tina Majorino production, but then it's also elaborate and weird. Perhaps it does fit in quite well. In fact, before the Tweedledum and Tweedledee chapter is the Garden of Live Flowers, which also is in both the Disney movie and the live-action movie. It's one of the things from the song, I mentioned it earlier. The flowers sitting and talking to Alice when she's lonely, but when she actually gets to Wonderland and talks to them, they're horrible to her, and they eventually kick her out of the garden because they think she's a weed. And then when Tina Majorino is speaking to them, it's a similar thing, really. They don't have anything particularly nice to say to her. She talks mainly to Tiger Lily, who's voiced by Joanna Lumley, and it's a bit unfortunate that she's doing a very similar voice to Miranda Richardson as Queen of Hearts, and because she would have recorded it on her own in a booth somewhere, sometime, they wouldn't have been able to compare notes and performances, and neither one of them would have any clue that she was doing a similar voice to the other one. Again, that's something they've taken from the book. The most vociferous flower is a tiger lily. In the Disney movie, it's a red rose, and she's really the only one who's prepared to give Alice a chance and gets the other flowers to sing the song for her, Golden Afternoon. And now I think we're on to our final character, and we only need to talk about him once. There's no comparison because he only appears in one production. That is the White Knight. In fact, he appears with the Red Knight, briefly, and that's in the live-action production, as has been said or implied. There are no chess pieces in the Disney movie. The White Knight is played by Christopher Lloyd, whom we've talked about in our podcasts on Back to the Future and the Addams Family. A very good, very amusing actor who always seems to play rather strange, eccentric characters. I don't know if he used to play more ordinary characters before he really found his feet as an actor. And of course that makes him very suitable for Wonderland or the Looking Glass world, or whatever you want to call it. There is a looking glass within Wonderland that Alice goes through as a bit of homage. The White Knight is really an ally of Alice's. She doesn't spend a lot of time with him, but when she does, she seems to like him. He has rescued her from the Red Knight, and if you want to read these disturbing things about Lewis Carroll and his relationship with Alice Liddell, you might read the interpretation that he meant to represent himself in the White Knight, Alice's White Knight. It is quite an eccentric performance by Christopher Lloyd, and the character falls off his horse a lot and says some wacky things, but it's also quite gentle and soothing. He speaks to Alice in a friendly, reassuring kind of a voice. And what I do think is quite interesting is that the lines he says are very, very close to what Lewis Carroll wrote, but with slight differences, which makes me think perhaps Christopher Lloyd was allowed to say the lines in his own way. For instance, when he hangs his bag on a tree branch to be a beehive, in the book he says, "Can you guess why I did that?" And Christopher Lloyd says, "Do you know why I did that?" And as a matter of fact, I think he improves the lines somewhat.
When we were watching Tina Majorino at Easter 2000, I had sort of started to let my attention wander and was thinking it was a bit long, and oh, why are they putting in bits of the looking glass now? Can't we just have the trial and finish by the time we got to that stage? But actually, Christopher Lloyd appearing as the White Knight did make me sit up and take notice. I think he says the lines terribly well, things like, "I should be getting some honey any day now," and so that's what happened to my sandwiches. As usual, it's just a very entertaining and arresting performance, and it plays a great contribution in Alice's journey to help her get her head together. Quite a nurturing scene in many ways, and well worth having in Tina Majorino Alice movie.
And that really is everybody she meets in both adaptations. I do remember being struck when I read the book that Alice's contemporaries that she mentions are called Mabel and Ada, which when we were children were names for very, very old women, whereas Alice, as a name, has never gone out of fashion. You can find Alices of any age at any time, which is further evidence of how ingrained this book is in the public consciousness.
Having talked quite extensively there about one of the classic Disney movies, our next podcast is going to continue in that vein under the title of Classic Disney. We've already done a Disney Renaissance podcast discussing the Disney movies from the 90s, and in this spiritual sequel, which will be released on the final Sunday in December, which is actually Boxing Day this year, we'll share our thoughts on some older Disney movies that we like at least a little bit. Until then,
good night out there.
whatever you are.